My next guest in the waiting room is an actor, comedian, TV presenter, and Chancellor of the University of Sussex. Amongst his many illustrious works, he is very well known for his seminal comedy sketch, Goodness Gracious Me, The Kumars at Number 42, India with Sanjeev, and more recently, The Indian Doctor, and of course, Unforgotten. He is a BAFTA and Emmy Award-winning actor, and in 2006 was awarded the OBE for services to entertainment. It is my great pleasure to welcome my next guest in the waiting room, the wonderful and great Sanjeev Bhaskar. Sanjeev, thank you so much for being here with us.
Not at all. I didn't realise I was in a waiting room. That just suggests we're going to move in a moment. But no, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to talk to you.
Not at all. As with so many of my guests, the beginnings of our story begin with where did you grow up, and can you tell us a little bit about your parents?
I was born in West London, in Ealing, and then was brought up in Hounslow, which was a few miles from there. My parents were both Punjabi, and my dad came to Britain towards the end of 1956. My mum followed a few years later. They were both my parents were impacted by partition, so they both were born in a Punjabi town which ended up on the Pakistan side, and so they moved at partition. My dad, my mum had family in what became Indian Punjab, and so she settled fairly quickly. My dad was a refugee. They kind of lost everything, and he and his brother and his mother, his father had died, I think the year before. So they ended up as refugees in Delhi, and you know, like many people who were impacted by partition on both the Indian side and the Pakistani side, and were uprooted, it's never been completely surprising to me that so many of them then chose to move to the West. I mean, it's you know, they'd been uprooted anyway. Yes. So a second uprooting was not as maybe psychologically damning as the first one was. So my father was part of that initial wave actually who came here.
About your relationship with both your mum and your dad.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a younger sister, so the two of us, my dad's brother and my sort of cousin, were the ones that lived in the UK, and the rest of the family were in India, certainly when I was growing up. My dad was incredibly, and he is actually incredibly sort of motivated by duty. Duty for him to the family and to work was paramount, I think. My mum was kind of much more abstract in the way that she thought. So I think a lot of the things that have shaped me, I think, have come from my mum in terms of creativity and humour and all that sort of stuff. And I think, you know, a sense of duty and loyalty and that kind of thing, I think I got from my dad. So I wasn't as close to my dad growing up. Sure. It was much more, there was a greater sense of, even greater than a regular teenager, that he didn't understand me or he didn't get me, whereas I thought my mum did.
Sure. I mean, I grew up in a similar kind of circumstance as you, but can you give everyone else an insight on what it was like growing up in Hounslow and in Ealing?
I kind of realised very young what the difference between the Western culture and the sort of Asian culture at home was. And it was about 2.5 inches, which was the thickness of our front door, because everything on one side of the door had a set of rules that you instinctively understood. But those rules were completely different on the other side of the door. And I think, so my earliest memory is 2.5. And I have an anecdotal memory. So there are things that I remember in huge detail from about 3 years old onwards. And one of those was that I thought that I understood the nuances of this huge world outside our front door, possibly better than my parents did, because I kind of recognized slights against them in a way that I didn't think they did at that age. Yes. So that whole pressure of being different, wanting to fit in, was more pronounced because there were fewer Indians at that time. At my school, there weren't many in the infant school and junior school. And so when I was excluded from either playing games socially, and actually even from the teachers as well, some of the kind of experiences I had with them, you know, you didn't know it was racism. You just knew that you were different. And so you were being targeted. You couldn't put a name or a word to it. And the desperation at that time is to try to fit in even more.
Absolutely.
And so I think a lot of those thoughts dominated my early childhood. And also because I thought, you know, I think I was pretty aware that I spoke better English with better vocabulary and a better accent than most of the other kids in my school.
Yes.
And so, you know, you try to kind of do a subconscious sort of tick list of why people aren't kind of including you in some way. And so quite early on I thought, yeah, it's because my name's different, I look different, and you know, I'd be embarrassed to bring people back, friends back to my house, because that would just expose a difference, because my parents didn't sound like me. So I think actually, you know, there was a certain embarrassment about being Asian, and being different. And I don't think that didn't change until probably when I was about 14 or 15 was when I started to appreciate that actually there was something more to me than, you know, merely trying to fit into two camps.
Absolutely. In so many of my guests, with myself, bullying has been a theme of their lives to a greater or lesser extent. And I know that it's been a part of your journey too. Would you be kind enough to share how it impacted you?
You know, for the white kids, I was, you know, the packy at that time. So you got beaten up for that anyway, and that was just in the air. But with the Asian kids at school particularly, it's because they wanted me to. And there was a specific incident at that point, which was that one of the kids said to me, one of the prominent kind of Asian personalities said to me, yeah, you can't talk to white people anymore. And I said, well, that's ridiculous. I mean, we kind of look at the country we're living in. That's almost impossible. And he said, no, you can't talk to the other white kids at school. And I said, well, they haven't done anything to me. And he said, yeah, but, you know, you're either with us or you're against us. And I said, I'm not with you or against you. I'm just saying they've not, I mean, why should I stop talking to them when they haven't done anything to me? I don't get it. And that was enough for them to kind of go, right, well, you're one of them then. And so that kind of hung around for about a year. And
a year?
Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, you know, the shadow of it was my remaining 3 years, but it really intensified actually for about 3.5, 4 months when no one spoke to me and no one would sit next to me in class and all that sort of stuff. And at the time, as I said, you just think about survival. So it was, you know, I was in the library a lot and didn't tell my parents about it because I didn't want to upset them. And after about 3.5 months, it began to kind of, they just got bored with it. But I never forgot. And, but it forced me to kind of reevaluate what and who your community and your clan are.
And there'll be people, and in fact children, who are listening to this right now, who will perhaps even find it hard to believe that you went through that level of bullying. Is there anything you can share about how lonely you must have felt in that period of time? And if you struggled with your identity, and you've already told us about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredibly lonely place to be. And the one thing that has come up in my life time and time again is that in those moments, it's impossible to see any kind of hopeful future. I mean, it's impossible. You're in the middle of it, and it takes up all of your emotions, all of your thinking, all of your strategizing, just trying to deal with it, you know. And it's happened to me 3 or 4 times where I've been in places like that, where I've just thought, I just can't see an end to this. I can't see a way out. But when I look back on it, there was. And it's it's kind of being able to trust that that will end. That kind of, you might be at the bottom of that pit, but there will be a point where you will come out of it. When I look back on that period and go, well, how did I get through it? Yes. I think there were two things, maybe three things. One was my sister and my parents. I didn't want them to know. So it was in terms of protecting them, I didn't talk to them, and I just had to put a brave face on it. That's the least good reason. Secondly, I think that I had just a sliver of, maybe arrogance, which was that I thought, gosh, everybody, I mean, when everybody stopped talking to me, it was, well, they're all saying I'm worthless. Everyone's saying it. They must be right. And there was a little voice in me that said, maybe they're all wrong. Maybe they're all wrong. And I think because I was so interested in deconstructing and analysing things, that I ended up deconstructing and analysing that just enough to make me not believe 100% that what everyone was suggesting. And the third thing, and I think the most crucial thing, was humour. Because the one thing about humour is that nothing physically has changed. Humour just lets you look at it from a different angle, and you make it ridiculous. So this thing which is horrible, suddenly you realise is horrible, but it's also really stupid. It's also really ridiculous. It's the same thing. And so it doesn't become just a horror show.
Was that creativity that you were discovering at 5 perhaps was sitting in the background but was always there and has now flourished into this wonderful career that you have? Was that your way of communicating with the world, especially during those times that you felt that you couldn't speak? That's
a really interesting question, actually. I mean, I had it, from 3 onwards, and it's now become, a somewhat apocryphal story, but it's true, that when I was about 3, 4, 5, something like that, there was an uncle who came to the house and said, so beta, what are you going to be when you grow up? And now you kind of go, you're talking to a 5-year-old. You're putting the pressure on there. And I said actor, and my dad said it's pronounced doctor, right? And that actually happened. And so the sense of creativity thing was absolutely there from the beginning. And what fed it, I don't know. I think certainly my mum, they had humour in their house, and TV and films was escapism. Suddenly, as a kid particularly, when you're watching a film or TV, you're not consciously thinking, well, these are white people, and in the white world, they're all cowboys, and I'm not. If it's a good story, you become part of the story. You imagine that you are, the main character or whatever. And so I think I did that really early on. The question about communication is a really interesting one. So when I first went to therapy, which I did kind of on and off for about a year at that point, at the last session, the therapist, we'd come to an understanding that we weren't actually making any more progress. Now we were just chatting, which is all really nice, but I was paying for it. And so it was, and so I kind of said, look, I think we're in a good place to stop now. And she said, yes. And she said, well, look, I think you've kind of, here are the changes I've seen in you since you first came in. That was fine. And I went in with a question. The very first session I went in, and she said, why are you here? And I said, I think I should be happier. And I don't understand why I'm not, because I have the skills to deconstruct stuff, but so why am I not applying? I'm quite good at work. Why can't I apply some of those things that I've learned there into my personal life or private life or the other way around? And so I had a question, and at the end of this kind of first batch, she kind of said, yeah, look, this is how you change. You're open about this. You understand that. And I said, yeah. And I said, can I say something to you about you? And she said, okay. And I said, when I first came in, I said, I think you'd taken a deliberate position not to laugh at anything I said. And I said, there are two reasons for that I can think of. One was that I wasn't funny then. And I said, but we both know I was as hilarious then as I am now. And I said, the second thing was that you interpreted that as me trying to distract, what's the word I'm thinking of? That's kind of the word's gone. Displacement, right? That I'm trying to distract you by being funny. And she said, well, yeah. And I said, you have to understand that I said humour is one of my kind of methods of communicating. So that's a very good question, by the way.
Oh,
in the last kind of 22 years or whatever, it's interesting that no one has ever asked me that.
Oh, thank you. I'm very grateful.
Well done.
Thank you.
And you're a doctor.
Thank you. not to throw any.
I don't have to bring that up. It's grating slightly, but I'm getting over it.
Thank you so much. You've beautifully talked about what therapy was like for you. May I ask if you can tell us the route that led you down to wanting therapy, knowing that there are people right now, and mental health is a huge part of the NHS and healthcare, and you've already told us that actually more often than not, and certainly in my experience, people are just afraid to ask for help. And could you share with us what made you even want to think that you maybe needed therapy?
Now when I look at it, had been very quickly successful, in the space of sort of 4 years. Going from being in debt and not having a job and everything to suddenly being in this position. And I still felt like a failure. And I thought, there's too much evidence around me that I haven't failed. So what is that about? And I can't work it out.
And so grateful that you shared that, because there will be people listening thinking, that's exactly how I feel. And I had no idea that Sanjeev and other people went through this. And in sharing those stories, I firmly believe that you do allow other people to just shine a little bit brighter.
Do you know what? It's the people, this is that thing again about not talking to people, is that you're suddenly left with just your thoughts in your head.
Yes.
And if they've started out as negative ones, it's really difficult to make that into a positive one.
Yes.
And most people don't talk about that stuff. Because it's not clear. Sometimes you kind of go, I'm feeling down. I don't know why. Let me think about why. Or it's shame that people think that you're giving people ammunition to kick you with, that somehow people will think less of you.
But there do seem to be some parallels to that time when you were being bullied and didn't feel like you could talk to other people. Do you think that feeling of failure had anything at all to do with those terrible experiences you went through as a child?
I think that almost every experience I had as a child fed the sense of failure. And so I think that did. When I then ended up failing my A-levels, that added in an obvious way, the failure thing. I then ended up doing a degree that wouldn't have been my first choice. That felt like a failure. I didn't do spectacularly well in the degree. I got an honours degree, but I didn't do particularly brilliant in it. That felt like a failure. I then, my first job lasted 3 months before I had a conversation. They said, I think it would be in both our interests for you to leave. That felt like a failure. I was in debt. That felt like a failure. I was in my 30s, didn't have a job, was living with my parents, no relationship. That all felt like a failure. I'd stacked them up. I'd seriously stacked them up. And that, I think, all stemmed, if I'm trying to think of a route to it, was not feeling that you're part of something when you're a child. And so I do absolutely think that if I can plot a way through it, then anyone can. And so that's why I've always been ready to help if I can.
Which, the way I've interpreted this, is really you taking responsibility for your own happiness. And you, as you so elegantly explained, you went in with a very specific question. How would you describe yourself now through that whole journey?
So the thing that I kind of realised I didn't have as a kid, I think that fed the failure, that, in a positive sense, I had creativity and I had curiosity. So I had those two drives, really important drives. I was lucky that I had those two. But I was, as a failure, you know, and as I described, you know, there was no step that didn't reinforce that sense of being a failure as well. And so I absolutely associated that with me. And what I realized that was also completely combined with a lack of confidence. I just didn't have confidence.
We have the great privilege of hearing these stories from you today. And in your journey, you've covered so much which is deeply precious. There's a huge amount of joy as well in so much of what you've done. And there will be thespians, actors, want-to-be actors who are listening to this. Can you tell us a little bit about how all of that started when you met Nitin, one of your friends?
Yeah. Well, do you know what? It's interesting that recently, I kind of said this to him actually recently, that, you know, I've known Nitin now since, I mean, we met when we were about 19 or 20, something like that. So we're kind of, where are we? Kind of over 30, 35 years of friendship, you know, which is fabulous. But I said to him not that long ago, I said, I've just realized that actually meeting you was the turning point. I was creative before Nitin turned up. Most of the stuff that I've done professionally has not included Nitin, but meeting Nitin was the turning point. And it was the first time that I met someone who was Punjabi, like me, who had been born and brought up in this country, who was creative and, you know, driven creatively, had the same references for movies and music and comedy and all that stuff as I did. And, you know, so our, you know, collaborating with him, you've got to remember that, you know, we met when I was 20-ish, we were 20, and we probably both wrote something and performed something for the first time when we were 21 or 22. I wasn't confident or had a career until I was 36. There's a big gap in between. So at that point, you know, working and doing sketches with him and creating characters and performing at university, I did in my state of no confidence and failure, you know. These moments of creating with him were like little oasis, because you're not then thinking about whether you're a failure or whether you're in the moment, you're having fun and you're creating something new.
You'll be too humble to say this, but behind that, whether it's chance, whether it's stars aligning, was the undeniable talent that you had to perhaps add and create the fire behind all of that.
It was all right. I've got a bit. I mean, you've got to have a little bit, but it's, you know, it's things like the willingness to learn, I think, was important. I think that a work ethic was important. And, you know, the curiosity, the drive for it. The thing at 35 is that you don't think, you know, you don't have those images of, you know, stardom, you know, be a star, you know, just have kind of people taking photographs and kind of, you know, lots of models, 3 models on each side. Which, you know, I mean, that was the thing when you watched movies, that was the idea of being a star. And now can I go, wait a minute, that's 6 girls. He had I mean, what was he planning? It's kind of like, he looks old. He doesn't look like you can handle one of them. And then there's 6 of them. And what was that awkward moment when you go, yeah, we haven't got enough room, and I've only got a Nissan micro. There's 3 of you. I'm sorry, you're gonna have to get a bus. I mean, anyway, I digress. But it was those, you know, those images of kind of like, you know, the teenage views of kind of being chased by girls and all that sort of stuff. At 35, you just kind of go, God, I hope I can pay the bills. That's all I hope. And so all of that had disappeared by then. And so, you know, in that sense, I was persistent, I think. I was incredibly fortunate. You have a certain amount of skill. I don't think I'm particularly great at anything. It's kind of, there's a few things I'm good at. My enjoyment for it, I think, is at the forefront of it.
In this wonderful privilege that we have of these discussions and these precious stories that you're giving to us, in the latter part of this, can you tell me what your thoughts are about the NHS and any stories you have of your dealings with the NHS?
Even when I was young, and I thought about what makes Britain great. It doesn't have an empire anymore and that stuff. And I thought it's two things fundamentally for me. It was free education and the NHS. Those are the things that made Britain great. Without those things, it's just Britain, which is fine. You know, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it's not the best thing. And so that whole notion of social medicine, free at the point of care, are the things that make the country cohesive. If we didn't have that, the last couple of years have kind of highlighted it, I guess, but outside of the fact that the NHS was under such pressure with the pandemic, that, you know, across hospitals, GPs, surgeries, clinics, care homes, you know, that extraordinary group of people were doing what they were doing under such extreme circumstances is one thing. You kind of go, yeah, I mean, that no one should not acknowledge that. Just imagine, I would suggest to people, just imagine if the NHS wasn't there. And you kind of go, one thinks of then the kind of chaos, the kind of, in other countries where it's affordable, where, you know, people who can afford it can get the treatment and those who can't just can't and don't and suffer. And that's in the end where, you know, I've never minded, even when I was in debt, I didn't mind my money going to something that adds to the social fabric of this country. So, you know, I get taxed, so I get less to spend it on what I want. My needs I've covered, yes. Right? The rest of it is fripperies. It's kind of like, yeah. And so if I have less to spend on what I want, right, but that money means that there is less strife in my local community because somebody can't get medical attention, because somebody, you know, has fallen over, because somebody who's old needs treatment, and that all those tensions have a domino effect on everyone else in the society that you live in. You know, it's kind of, yes, have the arguments about how it can be better, how it can be improved, how can, you know, they work in, you know, tandem. But to have the conversation of whether we should have it or not, I think is quite frankly bollocks. And I can say that from somebody who now has confidence.
And my very last question.
Yeah.
There are burned out doctors, surgeons, nurses, porters, receptionists, medical students, nursing students, trainee surgeons masquerading as wanting to be actors. If you could say one thing to them in our precious NHS,
yeah,
what would you say?
The one thing I would say is that, you know, the pressure on, you know, anybody and everybody who's involved in the NHS across this pandemic has been, to me as an outsider, and I could be completely wrong and I'm happy to be corrected, is that you've got the pressure of the job, you've got the pressure of the numbers coming in, the treatments that had to be delayed, the beginning, the lack of protection for NHS workers themselves in this situation, discovering what the challenges of this virus were as in real time, as we were going along, right? All of those things are the pressure of your job, right? I also sensed that there was a pressure of expectation from the rest of society to kind of go, on Thursday nights, we're outside, we're clapping, you're superheroes, all the rest of it. And that's an added pressure that comes from the outside. Before anybody was a doctor, before you were a doctor, before anyone was a nurse or a care worker or a porter or, you know, any of the jobs, receptionist at any of these places, you're a human being first. And so taking care of that human being is the best thing you can do in terms of doing your job. And the reason that people go into the caring professions is to care, is to kind of, it's not a kind of clock in and out, maybe I won't go into work today, so what if I'm a little bit late, who cares? It's not that, it's a vocation, it's a calling. And so the thing that drove that person initially to do that is something that's really precious, and it's really important to take care of it. So, people in the medical profession, particularly in the NHS, I hope would themselves, it's a standard thing that we all know that doctors make the worst patients. It's time to be better patients, and talk to someone, seek help, get therapy, see a counsellor, protect that thing inside that made you want to do what you do, and makes you want to do it well.